much for coming today. My name is Tim Lott. I'm a writer and columnist and a novelist. And I want to address you, welcome all of you here to the RSA for today's special lunchtime talk. Before I begin, can I just ask you to switch your mobile phones off, please, or to silent? And this event is being recorded, so if you'd like to share the podcast with friends and colleagues, they'll be available for free download from the RSA website in a few days' time, okay? And welcome also to those joining us via live web stream. And a reminder, the hashtag is hashtag RSA Brown if you'd like to get involved in this discussion or on Twitter. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Brené Brown. As you all know well, Brené has made an incredible impact around the world with her pioneering research on vulnerability, courage, worthiness, and shame. She's a research professor at the University of Houston and an author of a number of best-selling works on bravery, imperfection, and openness. And in 2007, she developed Connections, which is a psychoeducational shame resilience curriculum that is being facilitated across the United States by mental health and addiction professionals. I first came across Brené through her extraordinary TED Talk, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you did the same. I think it's now had 10 million hits, something like that. Just an amazing number of hits. And you thought it would have, what, a couple of hundred when you first put it out there? You were hoping for a couple of hundred, which I think tells you everything about her ideas. And I love the fact that it's grown from the grassroots, as it were. This isn't a hype. Brené is massively successful. I think, isn't Daring Greatly #1 in the New York Times bestseller list, or has been, or will be? But the fact is that grew from the massive upsurge of interest from simply a lecture. And I think that's a fantastic story of how interconnectedness can make us all a little bit wiser through access to minds like Brené's. And Brené's also brilliant communication skills, because I think it's very unusual for somebody at this level of academia and research to be able to speak to the subject so well and so wittily and so warmly, and I think that's a huge part of her appeal as well. So we're absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us today, and without any further ado, join me in welcoming Brené Brown.
Thank you. I feel like this is very hallowed ground here, so I was like, watch your cussing, Brené, watch your cussing. I want to thank the RSA for inviting me to be here, because I do think this is a very special place, and it's an honor to be here, where so many great thinkers have come and shared ideas, and I really appreciate, Tim, and your very generous introduction. I'm going to talk about vulnerability today, but I'm going to talk about an aspect of it that I have not spent a lot of time talking about, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about and researching. And I want to start with two questions that I really want you to think about. And the two questions are, what should I be afraid of today? And who's to blame? What should scare me, and whose fault is it? To me, these are the most profoundly dangerous questions that we center our lives around. And what they are indicators, to me, what they're indicators of is a culture of scarcity, a culture of not enough. And when you think about any milieu in your life, think about education. What are we supposed to be afraid of, and who's to blame? Politics, the economy, social issues. I guarantee you, if you turn on the news or opened a paper today, the focus would be, here's why you should be afraid, and here's whose fault it is. And And what's interesting to me about that is it's not just at a cultural level or a community level. That stuff happens in my house every week. Every week with my husband, I talk to him about what should be, why we should be fearful and whose fault it is. Mostly it's his. But if something doesn't go well at my daughter's school, then I'm like, oh my God, this is going to have huge implications for our university. And we should be terrified right now that she's not getting cursive. I know she's 4, but this is still relevant. And so when those questions become the center of conversation in our communities, in our homes, in our schools, in our offices, how many of you have ever worked in an office where the central question is, what should I be afraid of today and whose fault is it? I mean, if you've ever worked, you should have your hand up. It's indicative of scarcity. So let's talk about what scarcity culture is and what it looks like. Scarcity culture, I think, is best understood with a simple question of never enough. And you can fill in the blanks. Never good enough, safe enough, certain enough, perfect enough, relevant enough, and perhaps I think one of the most dangerous and insidious messages today is never extraordinary enough. Somehow, in the world we live in today, an ordinary life has become synonymous with a meaningless life. And it has huge, and I've watched it happen not only as a researcher, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I sit across from people and look in their eyes and I have a good sense of what's going on in their lives. But as a university professor who's been teaching for the last 17 years, it's been very clear to me that extraordinary means relevant. A couple of years ago, this is a terrible example, but the truth, a couple of years ago, it was huge controversy in the US because Rutgers University paid the highest honorarium it had ever paid in the history of the university to Snooki, the reality TV star of the Jersey Shore. This filters into our DNA and becomes messaging for us. And so scarcity is about never, and the top one is the big one for all of us personally, never good enough. Which is shame, which we all have on occasion, that sense that we're not smart enough, good enough, perfect enough, loved enough, promoted enough, we're not enough. So what we do in response to scarcity culture, I think all of us every day, is this. We wake up in the morning and we armor up. And we put it on and we say, I'm going to go out in the world. I'm basically just going to kick some ass. I'm not going to let anyone see who I am. And in doing so, I can protect myself against the things that hurt the most. Judgment, criticism, fear, blame, ridicule. I'm going to armor up and I'm going to be safe. And we rationalize and we convince ourselves that this armor is really smart. And we use a lot of different things to armor too. Perfectionism, intellectualizing. Truly, I have to be honest with you, before the TED Talk, which accidentally went viral, and was a total experiment, I thought, let me be vulnerable while I'm talking about vulnerability. It's a small group. How bad could it be if a few hundred people think I'm nuts? But before that talk, do you know what the name of my lecture that I gave all the time, all over? The name. Variables Mitigating Self-Conscious Affect. It never went viral. But that was my university-issued armor. If all else fails, use words that are really big, that you're quasi-sure what they mean. So we use a lot of different things to armor, right? But if you get really, really clear about what we're doing every morning when we wake up and decide to armor, it's this simple. This is what we're protecting. We're protecting being hurt for a very simple reason that no one really wants to talk about, which is this: love, belonging, irreducible needs of men, women, and children. In the absence of love and belonging, there is always suffering. And so what we believe is that we can protect our sense of being lovable and being acceptable and being worth connection with armor. Here's the very worst news from my research. The news that above all other I did not want to hear is simply this. And I don't even want to say it to you because I think it's mean to say it. But it's so true. And it's simply our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted, which is a terrible thing, but a truthful thing. That we can only love and be loved as much as we are willing to have our heart broken. And so when we move through the world like this, and with our partners, with our children, with our friends, in classrooms, with the people who work for us, with the people we work for, there are tremendous casualties. You know, I shared this. This is one of the most interesting things. I did a lecture in Miami, Florida about a year ago, and it was being translated through American Sign Language. So there were two people signing as I spoke. And they came up to me before the talk and they said, are there any words that you're going to use a lot that we may need to know about, because anything that's weird or clinical? And I said, well, vulnerability is a word I'm going to use a lot. And they kind of looked at each other and I said, well, we have a sign for vulnerability. It's this. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, it means weak in the knees. And I was like, oh God, that's not the sign. And they kind of talked for a second. They said, well, there's only one other sign for vulnerability, and it's kind of weird. And I said, well, what is it? And she said, it's this. I said, that would be the one I'm talking about. And so rather than walking through the world like this, most of us do this. And in fact, I think the troublesome thing about doing this is that it doesn't really safeguard us from pain, but it does prevent us from accessing the things that vulnerability takes us to. Vulnerability is the path to love, belonging, joy, intimacy, trust, innovation, and creativity. You know, think about this for a second. 85% of the men and women we've interviewed, 13,000 pieces of data, 85% can recall a time in school that was so shaming it forever changed how they thought of themselves as learners. 50% of those stories involved art and creativity. Now today I get asked to go into corporations, organizations, and the number one problem is there's no innovation. We don't understand what's happening. Without vulnerability, there can be no creativity. There can be no innovation. Without failure, which is maybe the ultimate experience of vulnerability, which can't happen when you're locked down like this, there can never be innovation. But I would argue one of the greatest casualties of invulnerability is this: empathy. Let me ask a question, a little audience participation. You share something very vulnerable with someone, and when you look at them, what you know is they deeply understand what you're talking about, and they get it, and they're really right there with you in it. How does that feel? Amazing. Thumbs up. Awesome. Supportive. What else? Say again? Intimate. Loving. Connected. Say again? Reassuring. Safe. Relief. You share something incredibly vulnerable with someone, and they don't get it at all, and they're just standing across from you. How does that feel? Shame. We've got the choir right here. Shame. Okay. Shame. What else? I'm sorry? Lost. Annoying. Rejected. Terror. Isolating. Okay, so from shame, terror, isolating, disconnection, these are not good experiences. And interestingly, guess what those experiences drive? Scarcity. And so scarcity seduces us into locking up our hearts and then keeps them locked by making sure that there's very little empathy in the world. So let's talk about some of the big blocks to empathy that are born out of a lack of vulnerability. I loved this photo because it's armor, but it's a close-up of armor. Sympathy. So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? How many of you think about empathy and sympathy as very different things? A few people. Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. I'll tell you why. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar, actually from the UK, who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. 4 things that empathy always had in common. They were perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth, staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do, recognizing emotion in other people, and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. So if Tim called, Tim, I'm going to use you as an example. Is that okay? Go ahead. Tim called and said, I just finished my rewrites on this article. I'm trying to think of something we have in common, which is writing. I just finished my rewrites on this article, and they've sent it back again, and I just have this overwhelming feeling that nothing's going to please these folks. So to respond empathically or empathetically, you can say it either way, I would need to try to understand his perspective, stay out of judgment, recognize what he's feeling, and kind of communicate it back. Now, when you're teaching graduate students who are new to counseling, they like to go, "Oh, Tim, you must be feeling so sad. I feel that with you." Which is not exactly what empathy looks like. Painfully sometimes, maybe. But if he said that to me and I went, "Oh, shit, I hate that," would you know? I've been there. I hate that. Or if I looked at him and said, or talked on the phone even and said, "Oh God, there's nothing worse than just keep on sending it in and sending it in." That's empathy. Empathy is, I'm feeling with you. Sympathy, I'm feeling for you. How would it feel, Tim, if I said, "Oh, you poor thing"? How does that feel for y'all? Okay, so someone just went like this. Like, keep it. So sympathy is about feeling for, empathy is feeling with. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is dark, deep hole. "Ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich?" Empathy is, I see you, it's bad, but stuff like that didn't happen to people like me. In Texas, who said yay? Are there Texans here? Houstonian? Y'all were my favorite right from the beginning. I knew there was something, empathically. In Texas, in the South in general, in the US, we have the worst saying ever that just smacks and reeks of sympathy, which is if Tim called and said, "I keep sending it in and they keep pushing it back." And I looked at you and said, "Bless your heart." How does that feel? It makes you pretty mad. Because basically what I'm saying is that sucks. but too bad, and God is on my side. I've decided I can make $1 million in Texas by simply selling a t-shirt that says, "If you bless my heart, I'll punch your face." So empathy is, you can't, with a locked up heart, with invulnerability, you cannot be empathic, because when you call me, empathy is not the default. Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. And when you called, man, I was just unloading the dishwasher, minding my own business in my happy place. And now I have to connect with the fact that, truthfully, I could wallpaper this room with rejection and revision letters. And I have to touch base with that place in order to be empathic back. So sympathy is one of the things that really gets in the way of empathy, and sympathy is also often how we respond when we don't want to be vulnerable to someone else's struggle. Does that make sense? The next one, I'm going to get hot talking about it. I just know I'm going to go into a little shame, but then I'll pop right out. Nothing will, if you're on the first row, you're safe. Blame. How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? I'm like, "Hi, my name is Brene. I am a blamer." Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm getting ready to go teach, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into 1,000,000 pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: "Damn you, Steve." Who is my husband. Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends, and the night before he went to go play water polo. And I said, "Hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home." And he got back like at 10:30, chatting it up with his friends. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed at 10. Therefore, okay, and let me just ask, because I'm going to assume that you're laughing with me, not at me. How many women in here are thinking, "That makes absolute sense"? And how many men in here are thinking, "Oh, that's how it works"? Right. And so the rest of that story is, I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, "Hey." He's like, "Hey, what's going on, babe?" What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. You're not allowed to laugh. You're here in official capacity. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? Even me. Like when even I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. It gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na-na-na-na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability, meaning that people who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, "Hey, my feelings were really hurt about this. No, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger, which is really hard. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, And it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was. The last one is interesting. Let me ask y'all some questions. When you are sharing something, I want to do a show of hands, and I kind of want you to look around at the answers. When you're sharing something very vulnerable and raw with someone, how many of you like the person you're talking to look you right in the eye? Raise your hand. How many of you like the person to kind of look away or look down? How many of you, when you're sharing something really vulnerable, would like the person you're talking to reach out and embrace you? How many people would like that person to stay physically away from you while you're talking? You're the people I would hang out with. Okay. How many of you, when you share something vulnerable, would like for the person across from you to say something back right away? How many of you would you prefer that person to stay quiet? Okay, so do you see what happened in here just now? Empathy is not scripted. I can't say, okay, go forth and be empathic, here's the decision tree. You know, if they say this, do this. Empathy is about being present with someone, and if you're present and engaged and you take the armor off, you'll know what the person across from you needs. But more importantly, if you screw it up and you see in the eyes of the person that you're, who's sharing with you that you've screwed it up, you can go back and say, no, Tim, okay, wait, I'm just a hugger. I'm here, I'm with you. Keep telling me, I wanna know, I wanna be in this with you. The reason why I think that exercise is so helpful is, again, we all need different things from empathy. There are no hard and fast rules about what empathy looks like or sounds like, but there is one that I will share with you from the research. It is, rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. How does that feel? Who said awful? Awful. Awful. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better instead of leaning into, if I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. And so I want to close with this picture, because how many of you, when someone shares something with you, do you worry about saying the right thing or being helpful? For sure, I think most of us. So I love this photo, and the reason I'm sharing it with you is because sometimes the most profound and eloquent examples of empathy happen without any words, and sometimes not even with eye contact. To me, if I'm sitting next to you and I say, wow, I feel like everything's just, the wheels are falling off right now and things are out of control, and someone just puts their hand on top of my hand and squeezes, that says, with touch, I think the two most important words in my work, which are me too. So thank y'all very much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you, Brene. And I'm just going to ask Brene a few questions before I pass it out to the audience to get your questions. I was interested on you touching in between on the way that men and women seem to express their empathy and their vulnerability differently. And I was just wondering, I mean, I couldn't see the hands going up in the audience when you gave that example of how they react differently to the blaming, for instance. Now, how does that work, and have you got some concrete examples of it from your research?
The gender piece is a huge question, because you can't really talk about gender and vulnerability without talking about shame. And so if you back it up to shame, what we know is that the biggest shame trigger for men is perceptions of weakness. For women, it's effortless perfection. Not only should you do it all and do it for everyone and do it perfectly, but you shouldn't let people see you sweat over it. And so how difficult is it to be vulnerable as a man when shame is about being perceived as weak? And culturally, we mistakenly think vulnerability is weakness. So it becomes very difficult to even, when we talk about empathy, to even reach out and say, I'm struggling, or this is hurtful to me. And for women, it's hard to say I'm struggling, because the mythology is that we can do it all and we can keep all the balls in the air and do it perfectly. And so the one thing I talk about a lot is that I think the place we have to start is understanding that we have to support each other, men and women, have to really support each other and understand that vulnerability is the path back to each other and the path to intimacy. You show me a woman, like, let's say we were married, and what men tell me all the time is, women say they want vulnerability, and they say, tell me you're afraid, and show me yourself. But the truth is, they're disgusted by it. So what men do is they get very good at pretending to be vulnerable. Just vulnerable enough to get off the hook, but not so vulnerable that they really cause a lot of problems in their relationships. So I always say, if you show me a woman who can sit with a man who's in deep vulnerability and fear, I'll show you a woman who has some awareness about this work and has done it. And most importantly, who does not derive her power from that man. Okay, so this is a strategy available, as it were. The more independent you are in terms of your psychology, the more able you'll be able to provide that empathy, is what you're saying. Yeah. And it goes the other way. You show me a man who can sit with a woman and struggle and just hear her, and as opposed to trying to fix it. Do you hear the rumbling? Yeah. I'll show you a man who's aware of his work and who doesn't derive his power from being Oz, all-knowing and all-powerful. And so it really comes down to, people always say, why do you talk about shame as the key to being vulnerable? It's because worthiness, a sense of worthiness, is a prerequisite for showing up and being seen in our lives. How do you show up and be seen when you're terrified of what people will think?
So you, as it were, have to stop looking outside of yourself for external validation, would you say that?
Yes.
And you've got to, as you put it, own your own story about what's happening in your life, and rely and have faith and trust in your own interpretations, as opposed to accepting other people's at face value. Is that correct?
I love that. I just wish I could say it like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me ask you something. I mean, you've had this tremendous success over this. Have you taken external validation from that?
It's a great question. Of course, I think early on I did. But then I ran into the very painful part of when you hitch your self-worth to what people are saying externally, that when you read really shitty, hurtful comments, or people are really negative, then you've hitched your self-worth to that too. And so I have I have an assistant who goes through all my emails, and the rule is, send me what's constructive. I don't want to, sometimes she'll aggregate the positive ones around some feedback, but I don't want to know if you think I'm a worthless piece of shit, and I don't want to know if you think I changed your life and I'm changing the world. Those are not really constructive for me. If you think that I should be looking at this body of literature, or if you think I could do this better, or you think I did something well, that's helpful. But it's very dangerous when we hitch our self-worth to what we accomplish, because that can U-turn in a split second. So I try very much, in fact, if you opened my wallet right now in the green room, you would see a tiny piece of paper. And so one of the things I tell people often is you should carry with you on a very small sheet of paper a list of people whose opinions of you matter. And it should be a very short list. And so there are 3 names on my list. And so that's what, and the people that are on my list are people who love me, not despite my imperfections and vulnerability, but because of them. And if everything went away tomorrow, they would still be there because they were there before everything happened today. So yes and no. I'm human, but I'm also really practice not to do that. I think it's so dangerous. And there's no sustainability in it.
Yeah. So you think if it all went away tomorrow, you'd be cool with that?
I think I'd rest. I think it depends on why it went away. If it went away because something bad happened, I think I'd freak out and.
Or because people lost interest.
Yeah, I think I'd be okay because I feel like I made a contribution. And that's a big thing. I think all the questions you're asking right now really point to something that's new for me in my life, which has been the last year, getting super clear about my values. And so one of my other things in my purse, my wallet's very important to me. You can take my money, but don't take my mental health. Is like a little mantra that I live by that says, at the end of the day, at the end of the week, and at the end of my life, I want to be sure that I contributed more than I criticized. And so I think if it all went away, I think I feel that I made a contribution, and we started a conversation.
Great. Okay, I'll just ask 2 more questions because I'm very aware that the audience wants to ask too. But simply for people who are not familiar with your work, possibly online or wherever, I think it's very important that you explain to people what the difference between shame and guilt is, because I think a lot of people have those 2 concepts mixed up in their mind.
Yeah.
And I think it's really key to your work that there is a big gap between those 2 concepts.
It's so funny because the people who really, I know, we've talked, you get the work in your bones, you live the work. But people who really know the work, I talk about 1,000 different things, but the people who really, have their head and hearts around it always come back to that question. It's so I think what happens is when I talk about shame, people often say guilt because there's kind of shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. And they're all kind of what in research what we would call self-conscious affects or emotion. And in order to really move through this work and understand it, you have to separate them out. And the big 2 that we confuse is shame and guilt. So shame is I am bad, and guilt is I did something bad. So shame is a focus on self, guilt is a focus on behavior. And it seems like semantics, it seems like kind of an academic pet peeve thing, but it's really not because the outcomes are hugely different. So just so you can try to start to make sense of it, how many of you in here, if you did something that hurt Tim's feelings, how many of you in here would be willing to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? That's guilt. Focus on, I made a mistake. Shame, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. Huge difference between shame and guilt. And so what we know from the research is that shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction, depression, aggression, violence, suicide, bullying, and almost more importantly, that guilt is inversely correlated with those outcomes. meaning the more someone is able to separate themselves from their behaviors, the less likely it is that they'll end up in those situations or suffering from those struggles. And so the implications are huge, especially around, I think you and I have talked about parenting. You know, as it turns out, there is a tremendous difference between you're a bad girl and you're a great kid, but that was a bad choice.
Can I just, I'm just going to cut you short because I would ask one more quick question about shame and guilt, which slightly puzzles me. If you say that doing something that you wish you hadn't done is the difference between I am bad or I did something bad. If you do something bad over and over again, isn't that then I am bad? And isn't that in a way saying that is part of who I am? And therefore, is it not saying, I've had this discussion many times throughout my own life, saying, I just did something bad. Yeah, but you always do that, and therefore that's who you are. Okay, so yeah. I'm suggesting that maybe the gap between shame and guilt isn't quite as clear-cut as you put it.
So I've thought a lot about that question as it relates to parenting and as it relates to school and behaviors in school and work. I'm going to come down on the side that I still think there's a huge difference between shame and guilt, and here's why. When we see people change behaviors, make amends, when we see positive behavioral change, you can almost always track it back to guilt. Guilt is basically, it's uncomfortable, but I'm a fan of it because it's cognitive dissonance. It's, I've done something and I'm holding it up against my values and it doesn't feel right. And so that's guilt. And other researchers use different words for the affects, but for most part, shame researchers use that as guilt. So it makes sense to me. Shame corrodes the part of us that believes we can change. So let's say you're my child and you lied at school. And there's a big difference between, listen, Tim, lying's not okay. And hey, Tim, you're a liar. Then the question becomes, you lie again and you lie again. And at what point is it not, hey, you lied, but hey, you're a liar? From a parenting perspective, to me, it's the point at which I give up believing you can make different choices.
Okay, and that carries on throughout life.
Yeah, because there's something very self-fulfilling about when I'm a cheater or I'm a liar and it's who I am, how do I do something different?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Brilliant. That's fantastic. And could we have some questions from the audience now? Yes, sir. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Yeah, I was wondering if you found from your research whether there are different triggers for shame with gay men and lesbians, because obviously you spoke about the triggers for genders being influenced by the expectations that men and women have of each other, and is that different in same-sex relationships?
So it's a great question. I'll break it into two parts. Relationally, in GLBT relationships, the relational dynamics are very much the same. However, when we talk about shame triggers, what we're seeing in a lot of the new data is that shame triggers for men, straight men, not always the same shame triggers for gay men. For example, in the gay community, appearance and body image can be huge issues. One that's emerging recently that I'm seeing more and more of in the interviews is aging. We have a lot of people tell us in the gay community, man, you hit 45, you're invisible in this community. So I think there are different, but what's also interesting is it's kind of a lagging indicator sometimes of what will happen with straight men, because for the first time, we're seeing more and more straight men talk about appearance and body image as shame triggers. Relationally, here's what I would say. When I say everything's the same, what I mean by that is connection, intimacy, love, and belonging, our connection, intimacy, love, and belonging. But whenever there is oppression and homophobia and heterosexism or racism or classism, there becomes a whole new web of things to manage in relationships, which not only cause struggle in those communities, but create unearned privilege in majority culture. So I think my answer is relationally, people connect and love each other the same. In terms of shame indicators or triggers, those can change in different communities. And I think we're learning more and more about that.
Okay, thank you, Brene. Yes, hold on a second. The lady there with the stripy top, please.
Hi there.
Hi.
The question I wanted to ask was, you used the word guilt and shame, but a word that always often comes up as well is remorse and being remorseful. What do you think of that word and what does it mean to you?
It's a great question. What we find in the research is that remorse and regret, which are two different constructs, I think, are functions of guilt, and rarely functions of shame. It's very interesting, Wellesley University at the Stone Center, which is a research center within Wellesley, did some very interesting research on shame and our responses to shame. And what they found is that our responses to shame very much align with kind of the old fight, flight, freeze. And so when we're in shame, the pain of shame is so debilitating that we normally don't get to regret and remorse. We're usually rationalizing our behavior in order to get out from underneath the pain. So rarely, when you see someone make a heartfelt apology or make amends in a meaningful way, I have never seen, in my experience, shame be the motivator behind that. But when someone really feels remorse and regret, that's often a function of really holding up a behavior against a value that we hold important. And I think that can move behavior.
Someone over there, yes, the lady with the pink top.
Thank you so much. Did you wait for the mic?
Yeah, please always wait for the mic.
Thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to have an outing on these subjects. You mentioned about emotional resilience or grit in terms of working through stuff when someone has kind of debilitated you, and you talk about shame being extremely debilitating. What if the working through with that person just debilitates you to the point of how are you supposed to work through stuff like that? I'm not sure it's possible. Your instinct is to run, run and hide, never see them again, because it's so destructive. The sympathy stuff you're talking about, that was a very brilliant illustration of the difference.
So I think your question is really important. And if I understand, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. How do we work through shame when it's so debilitating and so painful and we just really want to disappear? So prefrontal cortex, right, where we organize, rationalize the executive center, and then the limbic system, which is kind of fight or flight, survival mode. The truth is, when something shaming happens, we get hijacked by the limbic system. In a dozen years of research, I've never, ever seen, heard, or experienced a single person tell me, oh yes, and then so-and-so responded this way, and I went into deep shame, and I said, oh, I'm awash in a feeling of smallness and loneliness. And that's not what happens. The three responses they came up with Wellesley is we move away, we move toward, and we move against. So imagine shame puts you in a corner, right? And you feel emotionally cornered. Some of us put our hands over our face and slide down the wall and just want to disappear. That's moving away. Some of us move toward, which means we will people please our way out of that corner. And then some of us move against, which means we will come out of that corner swinging and use shame to fight shame. And so what I would tell you is this: every example, every interview I've ever done about the question that you asked has told me this. From the time something shaming happens to the time that you start figuring out what to do about it, there's time. Like, I know if I experience shame, I know exactly I know I'm in it because of the physiology. So people with high levels of shame resilience one of the things they're keenly aware of is their physiology. So when I'm in shame, I'll tell you exactly what happens. Time slows down, I get tunnel vision, I get really hot, and my armpits tingle. If I'm driving down the freeway and the car in front of me slams on its brakes, that's exactly what will happen to me as well. Shame is a trauma response. And what I know is that before I can start doing the work, I'm going to need 15 minutes alone at least. I'm going to cry for sure, and then I'm going to cuss like a sailor on leave. And so I've had situations where I've walked out of my dean's office, I've walked out of faculty meetings on many occasions, I've walked out of the room with my children. So to think that we can experience shame and then somehow get back from the limbic system to back up here where we can do the work and talk about it, it doesn't happen. The best thing you can do, like my mantra is, when in shame, do not talk, text, type, or email.
Thank you, Brene.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to the middle. Now, this gentleman over here, please.
Hello, I have two questions, brief questions that have come in on Twitter. One from Roman Krznaric, if that's how you say it. How is digital or Twitter culture shaping our capacity to make ourselves vulnerable? Does it help or hinder? And the second one, from an RSA colleague, Plamina Pelikan, I can't say that either, Plamina. How would you link being vulnerable to becoming a more socially and environmentally responsible human being? Is there a link?
Okay, so let's take Roman's question first. How does Twitter and social media, to make sure I understand, how do Twitter and social media increase or decrease our capacity for vulnerability? You know, this is what I think about social media. It's like fire. You can use it to warm yourself when you're freezing, or you can burn down the barn. You know, it's all how you use it. And so I think there are wonderful occasions where people have used Twitter and Facebook and social media to facilitate connection. And there are people who, you know, here's the big myth. Live tweeting your bikini wax is not vulnerability. You know, sharing your children's most intimate feelings about your impending divorce on Facebook is not vulnerability. Vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. And just because you can't see the people on the other end doesn't mean that you're making smart choices. And so, to be honest with you, I think social media is great for communication, but I think connection happens between people in person. Because if I call Tim, if I send out a Facebook that said, just got laid off today, devastated, I'll get 50 comments or responses that say, God, really pulling for you, so sorry, they suck, hope you find your dreams, blah, blah, blah. It's nice. But if I call Tim and I say, hey, Tim, it's Brene, I got laid off today, I'm devastated. Embedded in that is vulnerability, because embedded in that is a bid for connection with you. And that takes far more risk and has far more reward when even if he says, you know what? My kids are in the room right now. Give me 10 minutes. Stay right by the phone. I'm going to call you back. We'll work through this. We'll talk about this. So I think it's how you use it, but don't mistake communication for connection. The question from Pamela, how does vulnerability make us more socially and environmentally aware? Is that right?
Yeah, is there a link?
I think there's totally a link, because I think that what we need in this world, I'm going to sound like a bad American 70s song, is love, sweet love. Everyone under 40 is like, huh? It was a great song. And we need fierce love. We need like juicy, fierce, courageous, ballsy love in this world for each other, for the planet. And you can't get to love without vulnerability. And so as long as we stay guarded up, things like racism and homophobia and classism and, you know, those things that pin us down and make us feel small will still thrive.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Okay, this lady over here.
Brene.
Hi.
Thanks very much for having the opportunity to hear you today. It's been wonderful. I run a network for women who are childless by circumstance. So they wanted to be mums and it either isn't working out or it hasn't worked out. And one of the issues they have is trying to make a connection, seeking empathy for the pain they're in. And whenever they speak to someone, this happens a lot, most of us have had this experience, and try to talk to someone about the pain they're in, about not being a mum, they get closed down with what I call miracle baby stories, which are kind of a little bit about, or the, well, at least you can travel and sleep in, like that was my life's goal. And what's really difficult in those moments when they get offered the miracle baby stories, like, don't worry, I know this woman, she met this guy at a bus stop, he was on remand, they've now got twins, you know, is that that makes the person who's got the pain feel shame and closed down. And I'm often asked, you know, what do I do in that situation? How do I open a connection? And I wondered, how do you open a connection? Is it even possible in that situation to start that dialogue? Because it's about their pain often.
Yeah.
They don't want to feel it.
Okay, so this is a really, really important question. Did everyone hear the question? So this was such an important question that when I wrote, I thought it was just me, my first book on shame. The entire chapter is around infertility, not being able to have children, the whole chapter, because when I was going back and looking at the data, I was so struck that the women I had interviewed who talked about infertility when I was interviewing around shame, every one of them was in past tense when I was struggling, you know, this. And I was like, God, that's so weird, because a lot of them were in present tense. And I went back and I asked these women, like, first of all, I thought it was a coding error on my part, so I was panicked as a researcher, and I was like, so I went back with a random sample of these women and said, I've noticed all of these are in past tense. And what every one of them said to me is, I can't speak for the other women you've interviewed, but in the midst of my struggle, I could have never talked to you about it. I could only talk to you about it because I've come to some resolution. What I have learned is that it is, when we talk about empathy and empathic failure, it is one of the top issues around empathic failure. So do you have any children? No, I couldn't have children, or I can't have children, or we've been trying for 3 years. Then you get the stories about, oh, well, you know what, just relax. Or do you want mine? You know, or those kind of things, which is so painful. And so what I think has to happen is, in doing this interview, I met a woman who ran a fertility center, and she said, what we ask is we ask all the women that we work with to write a letter that says, here's how I feel, here's what I need, here's what's not helpful, and here's what support looks like. And my best friend at the time was going in her 3rd year of infertility. And it saved our friendship. Because look, I studied empathy for 12 years. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know what to do. And so what it forces a lot of people to do, and it's not just that, there are other issues that are as difficult, but what it forces people to do, and it goes back to what you said about owning our story, is it forces people to orphan that part of their story when they're talking to people, because I don't want to put you in the situation where you don't know what to say, and then I'm reminded about how shitty things are. So, and the problem is, we can't orphan our stories, because the only way we can change our story and have control over the ending is to own it. You know, and so to me, this is about shame resilience. One of the elements of shame resilience is asking for what you need. So let's take it out of your realm into any realm. It is very common on my short list of people, if I call Steve or if I call Ashley, my sister, shame, it's very likely that this is what you'll hear. Hey, it's me. I'm going to tell you what happened. I don't want you to say a frickin' word, and then I'm going to hang up, and don't you dare call me back. I'll call you when I'm ready. And you know what they'll say? Go. Shoot. I'll say, this happened, then I did this, and then I did this, and then I can't believe I said this. Dial tone.
That does it.
2 days later, 2 hours later, hey, it's me. Are we going there? Are we not going there? No, not yet. What's going on? Have you talked to mom? Because I ask for what I need. And that is inherently vulnerable. But I think if you love someone and you've got a struggle that you're not getting response back to, then it's incumbent upon you to reach out and say, I love you, here's what I need from you, and here's what it's looked like. You know, make a really big deal out of my birthday this year.
Great. Thank you very much, Brene. Well, look, we've run out of time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to wind up the session. Thanks all again for coming, and for some great questions there,
Yeah.
I thought. Now, there's going to be copies of Daring Greatly outside in the foyer now, and Brene will sign your copy for you. It would be really helpful if you could file out of the room as swiftly as possible after we finish, because there's another event taking place immediately after. So if you'd like to get your book signed, join the queue that will form in the foyer. But before you do, please join me in thanking our fantastic speakers.